Divorce is something in the modern world that we take for granted. We can have a right good knees up at a wedding, and then as soon as we realize that we are fed up, we can go to a solicitor and get divorced. I'm not sure that it is, but I think it might be one of the human rights on the Charter. If it isn't, it should be, because once you are divorced, you don't have to share your takeaway and you can bite your toenails without someone watching you. But alas, divorce was not something that was available to Henry VIII, who had a bit of a queen addiction. Unfortunately, this resulted in some queens having their heads removed with an axe. Hello, I'm Jinny, and welcome to the Tudor episode of Baffled History. This video is based on loose facts, assumptions, and some things that are ludicrous. Information has been collated from my mates, Shell, Alan, and a few others, along with the British Museum. Any complaints regarding the content of this video should be sent to my brother's friend Marcus, because he works in a human resources department, so he will know how to deal with them. So now, without further ado, let's get started. Whenever people think of the Tudors, they imagine people dressed like a kipper with stiff corsets who ate lots of peacocks and pies. Funny that, because I didn't know that pucker pies were around then. When most people talk about Henry VIII, they mention that he had a string of wives. There have been many movies made about him, and a very good Netflix series. In the series, they had several banquets, and I never saw one pie though, but my mate Shelley did spot a Kit Kat left on a table. I don't think they had those then, because they had no way of making the wrappers. So, what actually is a Tudor? It's a word we hear all the time. There were crisps during the 1940s in England called Tudor crisps. The company was later renamed Smiths. I don't think that the royal Tudors changed their names to Smith though. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. The origins of the Tudors are more regal than a crinkly packet filled with crunchiness. The Tudor era occurred between 1485 and 1603, and it started when Henry VII took the throne after defeating Richard III in the famous Battle of Bosworth Field. Richard wasn't a Tudor, he was a Plantagenet. The Plantagenets were at time the rightful heirs to the British throne. Although Henry VII's family had the surname Tudor, they did not refer to themselves as being Tudors. Tudor was the Welsh family name of the ancestors on King Henry VII's father's side. But the only person who ever referred to him as Henry Tudor was his enemy, Richard III. When Richard was trying to stop him from becoming king, he used the name Tudor just to be mean, because he believed that Henry was just some random Welsh person rather than an appropriate person to replace him.
Hey Tuna, come on, stop it! You look like a fish, Henry Tuna. You are going to be dead, mate, just you wait and see.
So, the entire era is essentially named after a royal insult, which is a bit like if historians in the future referred to our current era as the absolute Muppet dynasty. Today, I am at Hampton Court Palace, a building that is so incredibly impressive, you half expect it to be occupied by Elton John. The palace was bought by Henry VIII from Cardinal Wolsey at mates' rates. He probably had to get him a pint at the weekend too. It is said that Henry first saw Hampton Court Palace when he was fishing on his royal boat on the Thames. As soon as he saw the palace, he left the boat to walk across the field towards it. He was mesmerized then. Clunk, he walked into Cardinal Wolsey's wheelie bin, which had been left right next to the for sale sign. Henry's nose was broken and it was very painful for weeks. This accident left him with a lump on the bridge of his nose, and because plastic surgeons had not been invented as yet, the palace woodcutter called Geppetto made him a splint to try to set it straight again. This took months to work, but it eventually did. It is said that Henry VIII was the most royal king that ever acted as King of Britain. I think that if you had to buy him the perfect present, it would probably be a set of playing cards with pictures of him as the ace, king, and the jack. though you would have to save the Joker image for Richard III. But I suppose you would need extra large playing cards for Henry's image to be printed on them, because he was such a magnificent stately volume. Let me tell you what he was like. Firstly, I'd say that if the Tudors had been cast members in The Matrix, King Henry would definitely have been the one. Though I don't know if that would have worked, because my mate Alan, who works at the opticians, says that he heard that King Henry was probably colorblind, so he would most likely have taken the wrong color pill. I think that could be true, because that would also explain Henry's odd, other-worldly fashion sense. The old Henry was once young, though. The young Henry liked to hunt and ride horses. He would take his servants with him when he went hunting on horseback. His servants would shoot deer down with arrows, and then Henry would pose next to the dead animal whilst his portrait was painted. He would hang the portraits in the palace gallery to impress visitors. Years later, it is said that he would place the heads of his wives in cases along the gallery walls, and their eyes would follow people as they walked past. A bit like the heads of Princess Mombi in Return to Oz. For this reason, the gallery would eventually be called the Haunted Gallery. I would need to check this out with Alan, though. Henry liked to think that he was a fashion influencer. If he was alive today, he would probably have been an affiliate for Temu or Amazon. Henry's clothes would have been size XXXL. He wore incredibly big, baggy clothes to hide his majestic, bloated midsection. It is claimed that whatever fashion the king started to wear, other wealthy people in the kingdom started to follow his style. When he ventured into the nearby city, it was like he was surrounded by Oompa Loompas. Yes, even then, people were willing to look completely ridiculous if someone famous convinced them to. Henry needed that many outfits that all of the women in the palace were hand-sewing every hour of the day to keep up with his demands and the repairs. But Henry is not as memorable today for his influence on fashion as he is for his crippling addiction to wives and mistresses. He had an obsession with brunettes and those with the name Catherine.
Well, I love a good wedding, and there are too many Catherines to get through yet.
This is because his wet nurse when he was a child was called Catherine, and when she became his nanny, he fell in love with her. Oops, sorry, wrong story. He had relationships with so many women called Catherine that it started to become a total logistical nightmare for the palace staff. There were not only wives called Catherine, but there were also hundreds of mistresses with the same name too. Cardinal Wolsey kept a record of all the women that Henry had relationships with, so that he could keep account of any children born. The scroll that he kept full of names was kept rolled up in Wolsey's locked chest in his room, but eventually it took Wolsey too long to unroll the scroll. Because more often than not, the names to be added to the scroll were Catherine, Wolsey eventually could not see the point in keeping the scroll updated, and he gave up. Henry had other addictions, and one of them was food. He ate immense amounts of rich foods and drank wines throughout his waking days. Henry's regular banquets were famous for their sheer amount of food, ales and wines. The centerpiece on the table was usually a swan, stuffed with a goose, then a turkey, then a duck, then a chicken, and a quail. He also liked to have a boar roasting on the open fire in the center of the great hall. He thought that this made him appear to be rich and opulent, but it just meant the hall smelt like burning flesh and smoke. In the main hall where everyone dined, there was a large hole in the ceiling to let the smoke and nasty smells out. In the middle of the hall floor, there was a large open bonfire built, and it was kept lit for warmth and burning the odd peasant, or later on a monk or two. Around the room there were candles made out of animal fat. Henry liked to sing and compose his own music.
Do me wrong, to cast me off discourteously.
He famously wrote the song Greensleeves. No one knew who had green sleeves. Perhaps it was his nanny when he was a nipper. The banquets were very jolly affairs, with people drinking, dancing, and being very careful not to upset the king in any way. Henry would often play music and sing during such affairs. During the evening, the servants had to keep an eye on the fire in the hall, and they kept it stoked. There was no such thing as the fire brigade, but there were bowls in the corners of the room where people would relieve themselves, and this would be used to douse the fire where needed. Because of the heat from the candles and the fire, everyone would get very hot and sweaty later in the evenings. Most people did not bathe or wash during Tudor times. In fact, many did not change their clothes either. When the noble women needed to dress, there were many layers of corsets and petticoats to deal with, and assistance was needed from at least 2 maids with lacing and putting things on. Sometimes dressing took hours. Because of all these pungent layers of thick clothing, most noble women were like sweaty stink bombs. All of these women carried fans to ensure that they could cool slightly instead of fainting. Additionally, if any of the women needed to use the toilet, they could not lift their skirts to crouch over a bucket, so they would do their business onto the floor under their skirts whilst standing and then simply step away. Of course, it was the servants' duty to clean this up. There were competitions between the servants to see who could clean up the dirge in the most unnoticeable and respectful way. It could be that this is where the common sayings, getting shit done, and like shit off a shovel, originated from. They must have been the first ever pooper scoopers in England. My mate Natalie will know, because she unblocks drains for the council. It's a shame that they didn't have toilets in Tudor times. But toilet paper had not been invented yet, and no one had looked at a shovel and decided to dig a drain.
There has got to be a way to do this easier than having people pooing everywhere. I am drained.
I've got an idea. Get bigger shovels.
Drains. No, stupid idea, forget it.
Anyway, there was a pile of hay placed in each corner of the Great Hall. There was lots of spare hay for them to do this, because no one had any pet rabbits. So these corners were used as open toilets by all of the court members and their immediate guards. If Kitchen Nightmare had been around at that time, the kitchen would have definitely been condemned and closed by Ramsay. Now might be a good time for me to tell you about the Hampton Court kitchens, which did not have many cooking utensils, and there were no ovens or microwaves. Also, as yet, casserole dishes or air fryers had not been invented, and no one had started a franchise for Tupperware or Pyrex. In fact, cooking in the kitchens was done over open fires, and some things were simply hung on hooks to burn. If he was around instead of being dog food, I bet Ramsay Bolton would have liked to work there. It was because of the lack of equipment and inventors to think of making the right things that the basic pie was utilized. Originally, the humble pie was used as a type of cooking container. It was made out of a basic suet pastry that was not really edible due to it being sticky and tasteless. But this didn't matter, because like I said, it was a container to keep cooked food in, and as such, it was not meant to be eaten. I suppose it was the same as putting Edam cheese or Babybel in red wax to stop it running out before it's cooked. Although actually, that wax could be recycled to make cheese-scented candles.
That didn't happen. We are not Dutch, are we? This narrator is pants.
Anyway, this pastry was made into a bowl shape and filled with meat and vegetables, or anything that really needed cooking, and then it was sealed with a pastry lid. It was like having a little pressure cooker. Holes were cut in the top to let the steam out, and it was put on the fire to cook. Once served, the lid was prized off and the contents were eaten. No bowl meant no washing the pots. Due to this very rich diet, which involved little vegetables and fruit, people were very unhealthy and scurvy was common. Also, if the diet didn't kill you, the doctors probably would. If you felt ill, you couldn't just have medicine from the pharmacy because real medicine hadn't been invented yet, and ill people were given a tonic instead. Doctors were called physics, and they often poisoned people with substances like mercury and arsenic. If you did take ill, a Tudor barber, who was also a surgeon, who was also a physic, would often guess what was wrong, and they would cut off some body parts or do a bit of bloodletting with leeches. Sometimes, if someone had a headache, the surgeon would knock a hole in the person's skull to release the pressure. No one knows if this worked.
You have a runny nose. Yes, and red eyes. I think I know what is causing this. I want you to lie on here and close your eyes. Don't move at all. What? Oh my God, where is my leg? My leg, it's gone. What have you done? You are crazy. Now, all we need to do is put these leeches on your eyelids and to put this red-hot poker on your wound to stop the bleeding. Calm down, you are in good hands. All is going well. Your runny nose is gone, see?
Bloodletting was meant to cure ailments, but it was also considered brilliant for getting that pale complexion that was all the rage in Tudor times. The paler a woman's skin, the more attractive she was seen to be. But all that will be looked at in another episode because we have a lot to cover as yet regarding Henry's romantic life. Henry knew that he was not allowed by his Catholic faith to divorce any of his wives if he became bored. This drove Henry mad because it left him with the very messy job of having to have his unwanted wives executed instead. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, provided him with a daughter, Mary, and a son, Henry. But little Henry didn't live for long, and all of Catherine's other pregnancies had poor outcomes. To be honest, I would have expected her offspring to be of stronger constitution, as she was related to Aragorn of Arathorn II and Gillen, who originated from the land of Gondor. By the time Catherine had reached her 30s, Henry became bored with her. He met Anne Boleyn, who was as pale as a polo mint and as thin as a pipe cleaner, and he fell in love. Of course, the Pope absolutely refused to give Henry the divorce that he requested, so instead, Henry decided to change religion so that the Bible would allow divorce and witch burning. After all, he needed to cover all possibilities. To do this, Henry moved England's Christianity away from Europe and its Catholicism, and he invented his own religion. He had the Great Bible written, had his own cardinals and priests, and everyone trusted him because he had innate charisma, like most sect leaders. Henry found it was much easier to set up his own religion than the Pope had led him to believe. He then had the freedom to marry and divorce as many wives as he wished. By the time he had divorced Catherine of Aragon and his church was set up, he began to get bored with Anne Boleyn, even though she had given him a daughter called Elizabeth, who would later grow up to be a fierce queen with skin like egg white and wooden teeth. Even though he was allowed to divorce his wives now, for some reason Henry decided to arrest Anne for treason after he accused her of having an affair and had her beheaded. As time went on, Henry continued to get quickly bored with each of his wives. After Anne, Henry married Jane Seymour, who gave birth to a boy who was named Edward. He was a sickly boy, but nonetheless, he survived. But Jane died 12 days after childbirth due to a fever. Henry was devastated, and he grieved when Jane died. As time moved on, Henry's chief minister Thomas Cromwell talked him into marrying a nice Protestant girl named Anne of Cleves to secure an alliance. Henry agreed because he saw a lovely portrait of her. But when she arrived at the palace in real life, She looked absolutely nothing like her portrait. Because Henry had effectively been catfished, he gave her a quick divorce and chopped off his minister's head instead. This was the Tudor equivalent of swiping left and cancelling the subscription. After his marriage to Anne of Cleves had been annulled, Henry married Catherine Howard. She was Anne Boleyn's cousin and was only 17 years old when Henry was 49. Alas, Catherine was only queen for a year before she was accused of adultery and then executed. Henry's final marriage was to Catherine Parr, who outlived him. When Henry finally died, his son Edward became king at the age of just 9 years old. But sadly, the pressure of ruling an entire country before being old enough to shave must have been too much, because Edward died when he was only 15. Lady Jane Grey took the throne after Edward's death, and she reigned for 9 days before the Privy Council executed her. After Jane, Queen Mary, known as Bloody Mary, took the throne, and she appeared to have a thirst for blood. She had an intense hatred of Protestants, and she set about burning them on bonfires like sausages. The Bloody Mary cocktail was named after her, and it is blood red, because she was very bloody.
Oh, you found me. It is my break. It's been fun, this video making malarkey. Go Skamoosh, it's my break.
Even when she was young, if she was out playing in the garden, her mother would say to her dad,
Where is Bloody Mary?
Oh, that Bloody Mary is in the garden and her clothes are filthy again.
Even at that age, they must have known what she was going to be like. Eventually, Mary was forced to give up the throne, and Elizabeth I, who was Henry's oldest daughter, ruled over England long term. Elizabeth I was an entirely new sort of queen. She was pale, thin, and pretty scary. She, much like her father before her, became a fashion icon and had a massive following. On some occasions, she even wore breeches like a man, and she loved to wear a ruff around her neck that made her look slightly like her head had been cut off and was being displayed on a plate. To add to this effect, Elizabeth would put arsenic cream on her face to make her look deathly pale. This arsenic gradually poisoned her, and her teeth fell out, so she had some specially made wooden dentures. Over the years, she not only had a massive fashion following in England and France, but also in Spain. Well, until she decided to flatten their armada, like the ships were being delivered from IKEA. I think that if Elizabeth had been alive in present time, she would definitely have had her own talk show and would probably have been in Celebrity Big Brother. But because of the time in history in which she had been born, she was destined to be paid less than any man and would be sniggered at because she didn't want to get married. Elizabeth was a clever ruler. She allowed her subjects to practice whatever religion they liked, just as long as they pretended to be Protestant to others, so they didn't get executed. This is exactly like what some people do today when they want to start a GoFundMe. During Elizabeth's reign, British culture flourished. Theatre, books, and poetry are still with us now. Elizabeth even wrote her own poems, which included one called The Doubt of Future Foes. But although a love of poetry was common, theatre was the preference of most Tudors. Shakespeare was the star playwright, and Baffled History will be producing another installment about this hero of worldly words and pantomime at a later date. This is where we reach the end of this episode about the Tudors. The Tudors gave us pucker pies, lampshades for necks, cheesy candles, men in tights, the Protestant religion, and the British saying, "I am so poor, I haven't even got a pot to piss in." Also, their skill in decapitation was second to none. In truth, the Tudor legacy can never be forgotten. If you have somehow managed to survive this incredibly long video without being beheaded, forced into a completely new religion, or having your blood drained by a barber just because you wanted a pale complexion, Please do Baffled History a favour and like and subscribe, as this will help us to continue to produce more content. I've been Jinny. I will see you next time.